The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Tuesdays are nobody's favorite day. They don't have the fresh start energy of a Monday or the promise of a Friday. They just sit there in the middle of the week, grey and unremarkable. And that's how I was feeling when I pulled the envelope out of my mailbox. Grey, unremarkable. Unremarkable in the way that 64 years of living can make you feel when you spent the last decade eating dinner alone and watching the evening news with the volume too loud because the quiet gets unbearable after a while. The return address said Hargrove and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Beaufort, South Carolina. I didn't know anyone in Beaufort. I almost threw it away. I stood there at the end of my driveway in my robe and slippers, the ones with the little ducks on them that my sister gave me as a joke 3 Christmases ago, and I turned that envelope over in my hands twice before I went back inside. I set it on the kitchen counter next to my coffee mug. I made myself eat my oatmeal first. I told myself it was probably a mistake, probably meant for someone else, probably some kind of timeshare scam. I told myself a lot of things while I ate that oatmeal. It wasn't a scam. My Aunt Roberta had died 6 weeks before. I didn't find out until the letter told me, which is its own story, its own particular kind of grief that tastes like guilt, even when you know it isn't your fault. Roberta was my father's older sister. She'd left the family long before I was old enough to understand why. There was a falling out, something about money, something about my grandfather's estate, something that adults whispered about in kitchens while children were supposed to be sleeping. By the time I was 12, Roberta was just a name that made my father's jaw go tight. We had her address for a few years. Then we didn't. I hadn't spoken to her in 41 years, but apparently she'd been watching. The letter said she had left me her home, a 3-bedroom cottage on Fripp Island, South Carolina, waterfront, with a dock that needed repairing and a screened porch that looked out over the inlet. The estate had been appraised at $175,000. I read that number 4 times. Then I sat down on my kitchen floor, which I hadn't done since I was trying to look under the refrigerator for a lost earring, and I just sat there, $1,175,000. To me, Gretchen, who was currently wearing duck slippers and had $12.40 in her checking account until Thursday. The reading was scheduled for 2 weeks out. I drove down to Beaufort alone, 9 hours from my apartment in Northern Virginia, stopping once for gas and once because I was crying too hard to see the road clearly and I needed to sit in a Cracker Barrel parking lot and get myself together. I kept thinking about Roberta, about the photograph my father kept in a shoebox in his closet. Her and him as teenagers, standing in front of a lake somewhere, squinting into the sun. She was laughing at something. She always looked like she was laughing at something. I kept thinking about all the years. The attorney's office was in a converted Victorian house on a quiet street downtown. Crepe myrtles everywhere. The South Carolina heat in October is nothing like Virginia, softer, with a smell like salt and something floral underneath. I sat in the waiting room on a stiff-backed chair and tried to look like I belonged there. I was wearing the nicest blouse I owned, which was from a Chico's outlet, and had a small stain on the cuff that I'd been trying to cover with my watch. That's when my cousin walked in. I hadn't seen Dwayne in 20 years. He was my father's sister's kid, Roberta's nephew through the other side, which is a connection so thin it's almost nothing. But he had her last name because he'd taken it when he was younger, for reasons that were also whispered about in kitchens. He walked in like he owned the building, wearing a sport coat that was just slightly too shiny, and he sat down across from me and smiled the way people smile when they're not actually happy to see you. "Gretchen," he said. "What a surprise." It wasn't a surprise. We both knew it wasn't a surprise. He had someone with him, a woman he introduced as my associate without explaining what that meant. She was maybe 35, carrying a leather portfolio, and she immediately took the chair closest to the attorney's desk before anyone had been invited to sit down anywhere. I noticed that. I filed it away. The attorney's name was Mr. Hargrove. Older man, patient eyes, the kind of careful voice that probably came from decades of managing people's grief and greed simultaneously. He read the will in the way that attorneys do, which is methodically and without any apparent awareness of the human beings in the room whose hearts are doing complicated things. Roberta had been specific. The cottage, the dock, the furniture inside, the '09 Subaru Outback in the carport, all of it to me. There was a small cash bequest to a local animal shelter. There was a piece of jewelry for a neighbor named June who had apparently been bringing Roberta meals during her final year. Nothing to Dwayne. He kept his face very still. That's what I remember, how still he kept his face. The woman beside him wrote something in her portfolio. There was a final clause. Mr. Hargrove paused before he read it, just for a half second, the kind of pause that means pay attention. The clause stated that if any party attempted to contest the will or take legal action to claim any portion of the estate, the property was to be transferred immediately to the Beaufort County Land Trust for permanent conservation. No one would get it. Not me, not anyone. The cottage would sit there on its inlet for the next 100 years, with nothing in it but furniture and the sound of the water. Roberta had anticipated exactly what might happen after she died. The room was quiet for a long moment. Dwayne uncrossed his legs. He crossed them again. The woman with the portfolio stopped writing. I looked at my hands in my lap and I thought about my aunt, whom I hadn't spoken to in 41 years, who apparently knew people well enough to build a legal tripwire into her final wishes. I thought about the photograph in my father's shoebox. I thought about a woman laughing at something, squinting into the sun. Well, Dwayne said finally, congratulations, I guess, Gretchen. He didn't mean it, but he said it, which was the important thing. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think people sometimes expect a story like this to have a clean line between before and after. Like a door closes and you walk through it and everything is different. It wasn't like that. I drove to the island that afternoon with the address Mr. Hargrove had given me and a key on a plain metal ring. The drive out to Fripp is like watching the world gradually trade itself in for something quieter. The land gets lower. The trees get stranger. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss that move like they're breathing. By the time I crossed the bridge onto the island, I had both windows down and my hair was doing something terrible, and I didn't care at all. The cottage was pale yellow. Roberta liked yellow. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. The screened porch wrapped around the back, and the view was exactly what the letter had described. A tidal inlet, cordgrass, a great blue heron standing in the shallow so still it looked like something painted there. The dock had two boards missing and the railing listed to one side. I stood on that porch for a long time. Inside, the house smelled like old books and cedar and something faintly sweet, maybe candles, maybe just age. There were photographs on the walls. I walked from one to the next, like I was in a museum. My father, as a young man, laughing at a picnic. A group of people I didn't recognize, at what looked like a church supper. A dog, some kind of hound mix, sitting in a canoe with enormous dignity. And then one that stopped me entirely. Me, about 8 years old. In a striped swimsuit, standing in a yard somewhere, shading my eyes from the sun. I have no memory of that photograph being taken. I don't know who took it, but Roberta had it framed, had it on her wall in this house on an island where she'd lived her last years alone. I had to sit down on the floor again. I'd like to say that Dwayne disappeared after the reading. That would have made things simpler. He called me 2 days later. I was at the cottage eating takeout shrimp and grits from a place downtown, sitting on the porch watching the light change over the water. I've been thinking, he said, and I feel like we got off on the wrong foot. He said he understood the will was the will. He wasn't disputing that. He just wanted to talk about what made sense for the family, going forward. He had contacts in real estate development. The island had been attracting a lot of interest, vacation rental market, boutique resort potential. He knew people who could make something happen with a property like that. We'd all come out ahead, he said. More than you'd make just sitting on it. I watched the heron land on the dock railing, which held his weight with a creaking complaint. I'm going to need some time to think, I said. I said it pleasantly. I said it the way you say things when you're buying yourself time to figure out what's actually happening. What was actually happening, he had driven back to the island. I found this out the next morning when my neighbor June, the woman who'd gotten the jewelry, a small coral brooch, knocked on my door to let me know she'd seen an unfamiliar car parked at the end of my drive the evening before. A man and a woman walking around the outside of the cottage, looking at the dock, looking at the property lines. I wrote down the plate, June said. She handed me a post-it note. She was maybe 75, tiny, with the posture of a woman who had decided a long time ago not to let anything push her around. I thought you'd want to know. I stared at that post-it note. June, I said, would you like to come in for coffee? I called my daughter that night. We'd had a complicated few years. She'd sided with her father in the divorce, which had been 8 years ago now, and we'd been slowly, carefully rebuilding something. It was still tender in the way that healed things are tender. But I called her, Mom, she said when I'd explained everything. You need a lawyer. I have a lawyer, Mr. Hargrove. A lawyer who's on your side, not the estate attorney, your own lawyer. She was right. I knew she was right. There is something about having someone tell you what you already know that makes it easier to actually do it. I found one in Beaufort. A woman named Adele recommended her, a no-nonsense attorney who'd been practicing real estate and property law for 30 years, and who listened to everything I told her with the focused attention of someone who has heard versions of this story many times and is still, somehow, outraged by it every time. He can't contest the will without triggering the conservation clause, she told me, so he's not going to come at you legally. He's going to come at you personally. Pressure, guilt, wearing you down. Make you feel like you're being unreasonable. Make you feel like you owe him something. I don't even know him, I said. Doesn't matter, she said. To someone like that, the money is the relationship. I changed the locks that week. I had a security system installed, cameras on the front door, the back porch, covering the dock. I filed the documentation to make it official that the property had been transferred into my name, and I sent Dwayne a certified letter written by my attorney, informing him that any further unauthorized visits to the property would result in a formal no trespass order being filed with the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office. He didn't call again. The woman with the portfolio, I found out later she was a real estate broker from Charleston. They'd apparently already been to the property twice before the will reading, brought in by Dwayne on the assumption that things would go differently. The assumption that I would either not exist or not matter. I thought about that a lot. The assumption that I would not matter. I want to tell you about the dock. I hired a local contractor, a man who'd been repairing docks and fishing piers on the island for over 20 years. And I watched him work for 3 days, replacing the boards, straightening the railing, sanding everything down, and treating it with a weatherproofing stain the color of honey. I brought him coffee in the mornings, and we talked about the island, about the tides, about a hurricane that had come through 4 years back and taken out half the docks, and how they'd all been rebuilt before the next season. On the last morning, when he was packing up his tools, I walked out onto the dock alone for the first time. It was just after 6, and the light was that particular low gold that only happens in October, and the water was flat and dark, and the cordgrass was making its soft rushing sound, and 2 pelicans flew over so close I could hear their wings. I thought about Roberta. I thought about what it means to watch over someone from a distance, to keep a photograph on your wall, to build something careful and deliberate into your legal documents, because you knew that the people who thought they deserved your things would come circling the moment you were gone. I thought about a woman who left her family young and made her own life, and at the end of it, in her final careful act, chose me. I didn't understand it entirely. I may never understand it entirely. But I was standing on that dock, and the dock was solid under my feet, and the sun was coming up over the inlet, and the heron was there again in the shallows doing what herons do, just standing still, watching, waiting with that enormous patient calm. I said something out loud. I don't usually do things like that, talk to the air. But I did. I said, I'm going to take care of it, Roberta. I promise I'm going to take care of it. The heron didn't move. The water kept going. The light kept going. The light kept coming. My daughter came down for Thanksgiving. That was the first real holiday I'd hosted in probably 12 years. I bought a 14-pound turkey and nearly called the Butterball hotline twice during the cooking process. I made her grandmother's sweet potato casserole from a recipe card, so old the ink had faded in places, and I had to guess at some of the measurements. We ate on the screened porch with a space heater running, and the door cracked. The smell of salt water mixing with the smell of everything cooking. And we talked for 4 hours about things we'd never quite gotten around to saying before. She helped me hang a few things, fixed the cabinet door in the bathroom that had been sticking, walked the dock with me in the morning before she left. This is real, she said. Not to me exactly, just out loud. looking at the water. I know, I said. She must have really loved you. I thought about that. I thought about all the ways love can look, not always warm and close and easy. Sometimes it looks like keeping a photograph for 40 years. Sometimes it looks like a clause in a will that protects a person from people they haven't even met yet. I think she did, I said. In her way, I think she really did. I'm not going to tell you that everything is easy now. The property taxes on a home like this are significant. I'm on a fixed income, Social Security, and a small pension from the school district where I worked as an administrative assistant for 22 years. And I had to do a lot of math, a lot of hard practical conversations with my attorney and a financial advisor about how to make this sustainable. We set up one of the back bedrooms as a long-term rental through a very specific, very vetted process. One guest at a time, never the whole house, never more than a few months a year. Enough to offset the taxes and the maintenance. Not enough to change what the place is. Not enough to change what it means. Dwayne sent a Christmas card. No return address, postmarked from Colombia. It said Happy Holidays in his handwriting and nothing else. I put it in the recycling bin. June comes over on Wednesday afternoons and we play cards on the porch. And she tells me about the island, who's been here for decades, which families come and go, where the shrimp are running, what the water does in different seasons. She knew Roberta for 7 years. She tells me things, small things, and I collect them the way you collect shells on a beach. This is who she was. This is how she moved through the world. This is what she thought about when she sat on this porch and watched this water. She had a garden. I'm learning the names of everything in it. She drank her coffee black and read mystery novels and had strong opinions about weather forecasts and went to bed early and woke up at dawn to watch the birds. She kept a journal, which Mr. Bout Hargrove gave me in a separate envelope after the formal proceedings. 12 years of entries, her handwriting getting a little shakier toward the end, but the mind behind it always sharp, always herself. I've read parts of it, not all of it. Some of it I'm not ready for yet, but I found myself in there a few times. She'd read about me. I'm not sure how, the internet, probably, or word through family channels she was quieter about than we knew. There was an entry from about 5 years ago that said, Gretchen is teaching herself watercolor. This makes me happy. I posted about it exactly once on a Facebook account I rarely use. She was paying attention. From far away, she was paying attention. I stood in my kitchen, her kitchen, my kitchen, ours now in whatever complicated way that is, and I read that sentence over and over, and then I went and got my watercolor set, which I hadn't touched in 2 years, and I took it out to the porch and I painted the inlet. It wasn't good. It was the kind of painting you do when you're feeling something too large to say with words, and you need to put it somewhere. I put it somewhere. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything, actually, when you've spent enough years sitting alone with the volume too loud, because the quiet is too much, to have a place, to be chosen, to stand on a dock in the early light and know that someone from some far distance was watching and thinking, her, that one, her. I whisper it to the water sometimes, the way people whisper things when they know they won't be heard, but they need to say them anyway. Thank you. I'm going to take care of it. Thank you. The heron stands in the shallows. The tide comes in. The light changes the way light does, constant and astonishing, like it has no idea how beautiful it is. I'm staying. I'd been thinking a lot lately about what it actually means to deserve something. Not in a legal sense, not in a who has the strongest claim sense, but in the quieter, more honest sense. The kind of question you ask yourself at 6 in the morning, standing on a dock, watching a bird stand perfectly still in cold water and not seem bothered by any of it. Dwayne walked into that attorney's office assuming he would walk out with something. He'd done the math, the way certain people do, calculated the angles, brought the right person, positioned himself close to the paperwork. He hadn't visited Roberta in the last 7 years of her life, hadn't brought her meals when she was too tired to cook, hadn't sat with her on the porch or learned the names of the birds she watched every morning, but he'd done his math, and in his math, proximity to money counted more than proximity to a person. That's not cynicism on my part, that's just what I watched happen and what I learned from watching it. Roberta understood this about him before I ever met him. That's the thing that stays with me. She had anticipated exactly this. She didn't leave a note explaining it. She left a clause. She put her understanding of human nature directly into a legal document because she knew that words on paper outlast words spoken in rooms, and that certain people only hear what has real consequences attached to it. That's not bitterness. That's intelligence. That's a woman who paid attention to the world and responded to it as it actually was, not as she wished it to be. I think about the version of me that might have agreed to Dwayne's proposal. It's not a hard version to imagine. I'd been alone a long time. I'd been uncertain about money for longer than that. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from years of managing on not quite enough, and it makes certain compromises feel reasonable when they aren't. He was counting on that exhaustion. He was counting on me not knowing my own ground. What I know now is this. The moment I changed the locks, something shifted in me that had nothing to do with the property itself. It was the act of deciding, of saying, clearly in writing, through a lawyer of my own choosing, that I understood what I had and I intended to keep it, and I would not be worn down by someone else's confidence that I wouldn't. That act of decision was its own kind of inheritance. Roberta made choices her whole life that people didn't understand. She left. She stayed gone. She built something quiet and self-sufficient on an island far from anyone who had ever made her feel small. And then, at the end, she gave it to me. I don't think that was random. I think she saw something in the way I'd been living, not thriving, not giving up, just continuing, stubbornly, through years that weren't easy. And she recognized it. What you do quietly, without an audience, still counts. That's what I believe now. The 41 years I didn't know Roberta was watching was still years I was being myself, making my choices, living in ways that apparently told a story she trusted. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't require witnesses to be real. June comes over on Wednesdays. My daughter calls on Sundays. The heron is usually in the shallows by the time I have my first cup of coffee. These are not large things, but I've learned, later than I would have liked, that the large things are almost always made of small ones. I'm staying. That's the whole lesson. I'm staying.